Hey gang, it's KR King of D&D Homebrew. As longtime viewers of my channel know, I love to get comments. I heart virtually everyone. Can't believe anybody even takes the time to do it. And I recently got one on this topic, dividing the civilization from wilderness, from a viewer, Timothy Lamont 845, who said, one of the struggles I've had over the years is trying to figuratively draw the players the transition between civilization, where weird things are far more rare, and wilderness, where weird things are more common. And this is a topic rife for discussion because on the one hand, the far wilderness, remote areas are where both, in novels and real life, strange creatures, phenomenon, whatever, have often been observed. But also that transition area, I think, is really an interesting idea to create storylines, creatures, encounters, and whatever in your world. And by showing you the different ways that you can, separate those two areas, it gives you some options as to how to create those kind of encounters for your players. Now, typically, I run a frontier campaign, and I've got videos on this where I talk about the idea that, cities and villages and whatnot, settled areas are usually the most complicated to create when you're, homebrewing, because you've got to come up with all the people, the governments, the, organization of those people, the relationships between the different towns, the history of those towns. Whereas the wilderness is much easier. You can put some temples or, monsters or whatever, but you can sort of create it as the players explore. But even when I create that, I got to figure out, okay, here are the settlements and cities, and what's the divide? How are they situated in terms of this wilderness area, especially a frontier where it's this vast area around them? And one of the things is most often we will use this medieval, whether it's high medieval or mid-medieval, whatever you want to call it, setting, although I've used Iron Age and some other, but typically pre-industrial. The way humanoids arrange themselves in the world is to protect themselves from the dangers of the uncivilized world. Typically what this means is the towns and cities will be walled. Villages and hamlets might have some crude walls, but they'll be close enough to the walled cities that the inhabitants can go there in times of war. So this barrier between civilized and the uncivilized is physical. In the real world, a wall. You are going to have farms, agricultural areas where you need the acreage, depending on how many people it's supporting, that can't be inside the walls. So these farmers, too, have to run into the walled city or keep in times of danger. And then the edges of this farmland is usually what we delineate as between civilization and the wilderness. But of course, D&D is unique in that you have different kinds of humanoids. So the dwarves in the mountains, they'll build a city into the mountains. Do they have areas of agriculture or whatnot? The elves might have a city within their elven forest, but they control that forest as well. If you go into the outreaches of that, you're probably going to run into elves. And you have roads that connect cities, which aren't going to have walls along them. Maybe they'll have a day's ride out, some fortified little structure where travelers can stay for the night. But in those, road areas, what's the wilderness? What's that transition between them? And it's interesting because I've been playing D&D a long time, and I went through periods where I wanted verisimilitude in my world. I got books like, what was life like in the Middle Ages? What was it like in 1000 AD? I have a book on life in the Ottoman Empire when I ran kind of a campaign based on that. And even though it was really interesting to read that, there was some information you can get on how big cities were, or how big castles were, how many, men it took to protect them. Basically, these books were kind of useless. And I had to kind of go through that process to realize it. Because the world of D&D has a fundamental difference than the real world, which is there are monsters, there is magic, and the gods take a very active role in the world. So automatically, what you're going to have to realize is trying to recreate that, there's a very key concept here, which is when you have wilderness and civilization and you have a world with monsters that can do all sorts of things, you have to suspend your disbelief. Because walls don't scare dragons or creatures that can teleport or throw massive explosive spells. Hordes of orcs or hobgoblins or whatever could easily raid some farmer's outpost and take all his livestock and run back into the wilderness before anyone was there. So you couldn't have a conventional farm. Everything would have to be an armed camp, to fight these monsters, or you'd have to have massive walls everywhere. And, is that something you really want to worry about? So part of that suspension is when you create your world. If you have a world where it's super deadly, everybody has to batten down the hatches at night, be in a well-fortified fortress, kind of a dystopian world where, the monsters just come out. You can have that if you want. If you want to have a more traditional kind of world where in the civilized areas and the farms, there's areas where people sleep okay at night, and then there's areas of total wildness, and you better be careful. You just have that, and you don't try to explain it too much. And it's interesting because one of the literature that helped inspire D&D, Tolkien's Middle-earth, has this effect where, the Shire has been peaceful forever and nothing is, and I suppose Gandalf is secretly protecting it or something. But in reality, why aren't these hordes of monsters attacking these villagers? Well, he does a couple things that give you clues about this. First of all, the orcs and goblins are very sensitive to light, the original orcs. They tend to live underground. They don't like to go into these areas. It's only in times of crisis that creatures like trolls in The Hobbit venture down from the Misty Mountain to raid farms. This is an unusual occurrence, and they too are obviously very susceptible to light. It petrifies them. Now, of course, there's very fewer monsters in Tolkien's world than in the bestiaries of most RPGs. But what you have there is an implicit understanding that it's dangerous to wander into civilized areas. Whether this is out of just custom, whether this is out of their weakness, in these areas, but also that there will be retribution. If you go in, Orcan raiders, and start raiding livestock and taking them away, these humanoids are not just going to sit there and let this happen. They're going to set up a trap or something, make you an example of don't mess with us. And this can occur with unintelligent monsters as well. Let's say the Ankeg, which very famously, there's a picture in the original Monster Manual of an Ankeg about to pounce on an unsuspecting farmer, right? Well, why wouldn't they just be lurking under where there's livestock and stuff with their tremor sense? Same thing with Umberhulks and whatnot. Well, I think what would happen here is they would learn that if you start raiding these areas as opposed to out in the wilderness, now maybe they're right there and it's easy, every once in a while an Ankeg will come around. And then the villagers, what do they think? They're going to go to the squire or the baron or whatever and say, hey, we're being attacked. And they're going to find a party of adventurers, like the player characters, to rid themselves of this. They're not going to hunt there for very long. And of course, with a burrowing creature like Umberhulk or whatever, that's a plot hook. They've tunneled and discovered something that the players discover. It's kind of an added on thing. And the final ultimate reason you can always use for having civilized areas that are bereft of these attacks in wilderness areas is the mysterious ways of the gods. Because you could easily have some wilderness deity who's created this sacred forest she protects to all those who live there and worship her, and nobody better mess with it, or they get direct, blasting. And if you have those kind of things, the orcs and the hobgoblin or whatever, the sentient humanoids, the monsters are going to kind of be aware of that and stay away. And there might be unknown gods or whatever, or some generalized idea of these areas, these civilized areas that the humanoids themselves are not really aware of, or dimly the gods protecting them. The point is, you can just do that to justify this suspension of disbelief. All right, so you've established that you can have totally civilized areas, totally wild areas, coexisting, whether next to each other at some, trivial distance. How do you differentiate that? So, of course, the physical barriers of the wall, I already talked about that, and you can have this on a grand scale. You've got Hadrian's Wall in Scotland. You've got the Great Wall of China, the northern border there. In fantasy, you've got the wall in Game of Thrones. The first two built by conventional means, the wall in the Game of Thrones, fantasy, 700 feet tall, sheer ice, created by some magic and some mundane means. But usually these walls are at the edge of some empire or whatnot, from sea to sea, because whenever you have ocean, things can, cross through there. They're not typically all the way around some, vast area. Now, a couple things here in a game like, D&D or an RPG game, things can fly, teleport. This barrier is actually more psychological than necessarily a permanent barrier, although certainly lower level humanoids and monsters are going to be defeated by this. Well, as it turned out, this was the case in, Hadrian's Wall and the Great Wall of China. There was a psychological impact of this, where the barbarians on the other side knew that if they cross this wall, they're in Roman territory and things can happen to them. They're not familiar with this, and their back is against the wall if they have to escape, right? So even though perhaps they can get over and back and forth, and this happened all the time, you were taking a risk. There was a real implicit threat there. And you can do this in your own D&D world. If you could have just watchtowers, you don't even have to have a wall that say either on them written or a magic mouth type spell, this is you are entering this empire, this realm. You better watch out. You better not come through. And another thing that you can do, posts that have the rotting corpses of the idiots who, crossed over into this territory as mute testaments to the empire's power, which is kind of cool. But the thing about a physical barrier like this, what lives along the wall? On either side? Are there communities? Is there a watch like the Night's Watch in Game of Thrones? Are there communities of things that, back and forth, smugglers and whatnot that, do this illegal commerce? Is it a cursed area, the sign of some battle or something? This wall is perhaps not even physical, but in this area, this dividing line is there. Nothing lives there or whatever. The wall itself might be this sort of, there had been this apocalyptic magic battle. It's called the negative zone, where everything was opposite of itself and magic operated weirdly. And this was a barrier between the far wilderness and the civilized lands. And then there's a barrier that I've used twice in campaigns, which is the mega magical barrier. Sort of an epic-sized Liam's tiny hut, which covers literally a whole city. I had the city of powerful magic users who all got together. This wasn't just a spell. This is an artifact. They all had to work together. And they created this dome that prevented anything from flying in, walking in, or burrowing in from underneath. You had to know, you either had to have these runes or know certain spells at certain gate areas to get in. And the players found out that the magic here had this vibration, and they could use these frequencies that they came up with to make a hole and sneak in and sneak out. But the main thing was it totally protected them in a D&D sense from anyone getting in or out from the wilderness to the civilized area. And I had another one, in the 70s, we loved the movie Logan's Run. We loved Jenny Agutter, the star. And the idea there of an entire, civilization, I think it was a city, but I think, D&D-ized it. We made it into this civilization that had the same concept. And what happened there was you have this idea that since it's this whole world, sustained world, that you don't have to have any commerce in between them. The outside world becomes barbaric and savage, and the world inside becomes indolent and weak. They're using, clockworks and constructs and stuff to do all the work, and they're just laying around type thing. And we had the exterior had all sorts, because it was a post-apocalyptic thing, which we really like to use in those days as a justification for the D&D world. I had mutants and stuff, radiation things, and it was kind of a Gamma World type thing. I also played Gamma World and Metamorphs itself, those kind of games. So, we always kind of had those things bleed into our campaigns. But the thing you see here with the physical barriers, you can have a very stark transition between civilization and the wilderness. But this is not typical, right? Most of the time, there is some kind of transition from civilization to wilderness. And this transition zone is a very interesting place for you to set up different encounters, different monsters, different, civilizations or groups of people that live together or travel back and forth. And oftentimes we think of a barrier, a physical barrier like geography, a mountain range, a desert, some body of water, and that's true, and you can have that. You can have civilization come right up to the edge of water, and beyond that, there's nothing. But if you have mountains or a desert, usually there's some transition. You have agricultural area, and then the land starts to get, rocky and some trees. It's not good for farming. And then it gets hilly and whatnot, and then turns into mountains. And how far out from that agricultural zone does it go before it becomes true wilderness? This I call a transition zone. And I use 5-mile hexes. So I used to say maybe 10 to 20 miles transition zone. You can use 100 miles. You can use 1,000. But I kind of like the idea of keeping it low, because this band in there, you still had to travel through it. Let's say maybe you make it 50 miles just to be more realistic. Although again, we're throwing verisimilitude out the window all the time. But whatever the case, you would have outsiders, people that have escaped justice or something. You might have like witches or some hermit wizard, or who knows who would live there, because they've got access to the civilized areas, but they're not under its rules. The frontier in North America in the 18th and early 19th century, right? Where people just lived free, as it were. The indigenous people didn't care for it, but, there was no law and order there. Or if it did come to that place, it took a long time. So, think about what sort of, cities or villages or, encampments of people would be in these transition zones, these areas between civilization and the wilderness. How does that transfer work? If it's 20 miles, the first 5 are very close. There's a lot of trade and stuff going back and forth. But as you get closer to the wilderness, it gets more rustic and whatnot. Again, if you want to make those distances more realistic and much farther, that's fine as well. But you're not quite in the true wilderness. The other thing is monsters and humanoids from the deep wilderness would come to these areas perhaps to trade with those civilized humanoids that come and live there. So you've got this, again, when I say neutral zone, it's also a neutral zone in terms of not warring with each other. You may have cities that are everyone accepts the fact that we are going to trade or do whatever, all sorts of thieves and, rogues encampments, all sorts of great things because you're between the two places here. And that is a really interesting idea to set up as, in terms of the between of totally crazy and totally civilized. So to sum up, don't sweat the verisimilitude of having civilized areas where nothing bad happens in the wilderness. Then when you make that divide, decide if it's going to be a physical barrier. The change between civilized and wilderness can be very stark. It can be as simple as there is no civilized area. At night, everyone has to lock themselves in their houses and it's total craziness. Or they protected themselves in these walls. But again, once you go 1 mile out, it's, the negative zone or whatever. Or as I like to do, the transition zones, where things don't just go civilized wilderness, but there's that period, that geographical area, and it might be up to mountains, it might be up to some desert or something, where things are a little murky. It can be really fun. And if you like what you've seen on my channel, please subscribe. Always looking for more. Love to hear those comments. Thank you, Thomas, for this one. Inspired a video. I think I might do one on, more in-depth on the transition zones in the future. But most importantly, keep playing an RPG game, whatever one you prefer, and tell somebody else about it.